I am Professor Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University. I'm so delighted to see the numbers of you on the bottom of my screen who are joining us tonight for the Ruth and Alvin Rockoff Annual Lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Lynne Swarts. And the title of the lecture is From Femme Fatale to the New Jewish Woman, Gender, Nationalism, and Orientalism in the Art of Ephraim Moses Lilien. Let me just remind you, because not all of us are still used to Zoom land, this is a webinar format. All of you are muted. If you want to ask a question, and I hope you will, please put it into the chat. Please feel free to ask Dr. Swarts anything about her lecture, about the visual images you're going to see, and about cultural and political Zionism, etc. So if you do that, then at the end of our session, we can engage in a more robust conversation with our scholar. I will be moderating these questions, and I will pose them to Dr. Swarts at the second part of the program. The webinar is being recorded, so if you want to revisit or share it with other people, you will be able to have access to it on the Bildner Center website. So let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Lynne Swarts holds a BA in Visual Arts, an MA in Art History from the University of New South Wales, and a PhD from the History Department of the University of Sydney. She is a cultural and intellectual historian with a special interest in European Jewish history, gender studies, and visual culture. She is a research affiliate and adjunct lecturer in the Department of History and in the Department of Hebrew, Biblical, and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney. She is also a lecturer at the University of Technology in Sydney. Her first book, from which this lecture is drawn, is entitled Gender, Orientalism, and the Jewish Nation, Women in the Works of Ephraim Moses Lilien at the German Fin de Siècle. And it was published in 2020 and republished in 2021 by Bloomsbury Academic Press as a paperback edition, which is terrific. When a book goes to paperback, it generally is more widely read. So that's fantastic. And a book of visual culture, that says a lot. So congratulations to you, Lynne.
Thank you.
Dr. Swarts has been a Sir Zelman Cowen University Fellow at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she's written in a variety of venues besides this book, including the feminist journal Nashim, the Oxford Journal Studies in Contemporary Jewry, and in the interdisciplinary journal Shofar. She's also written for more popular venues such as Tablet Magazine. I'm delighted she's here with us tonight, all the way from Sydney, Australia. So it's not even tonight, it's late morning tomorrow. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynne Swarts.
Okay, so can I share my screen with you all? Are we all there?
Yes,
yep.
We see it.
Great. All right. I will begin. Thank you, Nancy, for your kind words. I'm extremely honoured to be giving the Ruth and Alvin Rockoff Annual Lecture tonight for the Bildner Centre for the Study of Jewish Life, even though it is all the way from Sydney, Australia in the morning. Just to fill you in a little bit, very briefly, my husband grew up in Highland Park and his sister, mother and father attended Rutgers University. But perhaps even more remarkable is that some of his friends, which I'm sure are listening to this lecture tonight, knew the children of the Rockoffs and remarked to me this week that their parents, Ruth and Alvin, were wonderful people. So that is just so very heartwarming for me to know and have that connection with you. Now, first, as is customary in Australia, I begin with an acknowledgement of country, and I give this talk on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in the northern suburbs of the Sydney Basin. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now, as Nancy kindly told you, my talk today is titled From Femme Fatale to the New Jewish Woman, and it concentrates on the representations of women in the artwork of Ephraim Moses Lilien at the turn of the 20th century. And some of these images, I think some of his most important, well, at least for me, appear here in this opening slide. I was tempted, and I always am tempted, to call my lectures or book Lilien's Women and the Male Gaze, because I think this is the important part. Lilien, as a male artist, gives us these imagined images of the new Jewish woman from his gendered gaze at a moment when Jewish men could have a place in what was at stake here. Because they were powerful, because they had exhibits which women didn't have necessarily, in the creation of what was a more complex, nuanced image of the new Jewish woman. And because Nancy has nicely suggested that my book first came out as a hardcover in 2020 and then as a soft cover, you can see that it actually focuses on Lilien's images through the lens of gender Orientalism and Jewish nationalism. So what I want to do in this talk today is introduce you to E.M. Lilien and his art, answering that perennial question we all want to know, which is, why is his work important? And perhaps even more interesting for me is, are his images, and maybe for you, are his images still relevant? Incorporated into that assessment is the historiography around Lilien's construction of the muscular male Jew in Zionist aesthetics, and his role in the image making of the ideal male body in the Jewish national psyche. And these ideas, in turn, were based on mid-18th century concepts of beauty as personified by the classical Greeks: muscular, healthy, and fit. Then I will go on to discuss Lilien's images of women, largely because there was very little written on Lilien's female imagery. It became the subject of my research and of my book, and I separate his oeuvre into three different subcategories: the femme fatale, which just means in English the dangerous woman or dangerous female, the biblical heroine, and the sensual orientalized beauty, in order to consider whether Lilien's images helped create a fully realized representation of a thoroughly modern, even beautiful new Jewess. And then I'll make or draw a few conclusions. As stated in perhaps the flyer that many of you might have received online, Lilien was one of the most important Jewish artists of modern times. He was a successful illustrator, a photographer, a painter, a printmaker, a graphic arts editor, and even a budding filmmaker. He became the first major Zionist artist and the first modern Jewish artist to create an entire book of biblical illustrations. Lilien, though known as a German Jewish artist, was actually born in Drohobych in the then far-flung eastern province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of Galicia. And you can see that I've circled Drohobych for you. Of course, today it is part of the West Ukraine. He studied art in Krakow, which you can see is to the west of Drohobych, then headed to Munich, and then eventually Berlin, making a name for himself in the cultural Zionist movement under the guidance of Martin Buber, perhaps an incredibly well-known German Jewish intellectual in the first half of the 20th century, and also under the guidance of the political Zionist leadership of Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau. From the publication of his first purposeful Jewish illustrations in Judah, shown here on the left, to his creation of heroic biblical figures for the books of the Bible, shown here on the right, Lilien's male imagery has been the focus of numerous historical, cultural, and aesthetic analyses. His artwork remains important because it both reflects and constructed a concrete image of the intellectual debates swirling around early Zionism in the late 19th century. Debates which centered around what type of Jews and what type of Jewry were appropriate for a changing modern world, focusing on the construction of a new muscular Jew. Indeed, Lilien's male images have been addressed mainly in the context of this self-consciously masculine history of the Zionist movement, where his illustrations helped facilitate the construction of a new, in brackets, male Jew. I argue that the omission of women in this discussion has diminished our understanding of Lilien's full representation of the new Jew. Lilien was born into a poor Eastern European Jewish family in the Empire of the Habsburgs in 1874. You can see here on the right an etching he did of his town when visiting his mother just before the Great War. The memory of Jewish life there was entirely obliterated between 1939 and 1945, though Lilien's affectionate etching, The Central Marketplace, remains. If any of you are familiar with Drohobych, you may know that it was also from where Maurice Gottlieb came, perhaps a decade before Lilien, and where Bruno Schulz, the very famous Polish Jewish writer and art teacher, was famously shot down outside his house by the Nazis in 1942. By the time Lilien was 16, he'd moved to Krakow to study art at the Art Academy there. And these are some images I took in 2016 when I went to do some research in their archives. And he studied there under the Polish nationalist Jan Matejko, who strongly encouraged history painting amongst his acolytes. And that really included the use of props, the use of costumes, and a strong narrative. Unfortunately, for Lilien and for those who may have been studying there who were Jewish, it came with a large dose of anti-Semitism. And Lilien left for Vienna around 1893, just as Matejko was dying. And we don't know why he left. Was it because of the increasing anti-Semitism, or was it just because he ran out of money? He went on to Munich, and then by 1899, he was living and working in Berlin. Now, by the time this famous self-portrait was made in 1912, Lilien had reinvented himself as a middle-class German burgher or bourgeoisie. He's in a bow tie and a suit coat at his draft table. He's no longer looking, at least, extremely poor or religious. But in the background, positioned prominently, is the well-known postcard that Lilien created for the 5th Zionist Congress of 1901, which, along with the Book of Judah, published the year before that we've just seen, helped establish his artistic career. His images were created in the flowing, linear, black and white style called Jugendstil, or youth style, which was the German equivalent of the French movement Art Nouveau, which just stood in for new art. Lilien's friends and colleagues, this work is actually an enlargement of the work that is the postcard, positioned prominently behind him in his self-portrait. We will, if you want to, have a little further look at this in the Q&A. Lilien's friends and colleagues also included many of the Central European, German-speaking, Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals who came to prominence during this era. He was a kind of modern-day Kevin Bacon. He knew many of the modernist bohemians and artists in Berlin who congregated at the Nollendorfplatz Cafe and Casino, including his friend Stefan Zweig, the well-known assimilated Austrian-born Jewish writer, journalist and literary figure. And he actually contributed the introduction to the very first book on Lilien's oeuvre in 1903. And you can see down the bottom, it actually says, with an introduction by Stefan Zweig. He also knew many, and collaborated with many non-Jewish intellectuals of the period. The poet Boris von Munchausen, the Baron, who had written the text, it was actually a Hebrew poem, for Judah. The Lutheran pastor Ferdinand Rauweiss, who'd written the text for the books of the Bible, and even the Russian socialist Maxim Gorky, imaged here, whose writings he also illustrated. Now, as we can see, this is the work that he did called The Silent Song. And I'm not going to decode this either, but we can at the end of the Q&A. But what I want to point out is just the importance of his work in the German Jewish imagination at this period. And that is because of the reception that happened or that he required to his book, Judah, when it was published. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of the raw statistics. Between 1900 to 1910, 5 editions of this book, Judah, were published and 12,000 copies were in circulation. Now, considering that the population of Berlin by 1910 was roughly 2 million, and 100,000 of those were probably Jews, it's roughly 12% of the Jewish population of Berlin. And of course, that doesn't include those who were reading his books in free Jewish libraries, which were set up in Berlin and elsewhere during this period, or in cafes. And then by 1920, there was 3 times that amount of copies in circulation, which just shows you that so many of those German Jewish people at that moment in time were looking at his work and enjoying it immensely. This figure doesn't even include the non-Jewish population who are also reading his book, although statistics here are harder to collect. Certainly the few non-Jewish reviews available suggest the reading public were well aware of his work and appreciated his modernist style. Lilien and his career was launched. Lilien's vision of a muscular Jewish hero, seen here clearly in this 1903 image of the creation of first man Adam, integrated 2 major Jewish concerns at the Fin de Siècle. Max Nordau's call for a regeneration of the modern Jew into a Muskeljude, or muscular Jew, who would prove his worth on the sporting field in the tradition of the German nationalist or Turnverein gymnastics movement. This muscular Jew would become a living proof of a new masculinity, even military virility. And the second was Buber's proposal for a spiritually inspired construction of Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch, a kind of Renaissance man, fused with the German romantic ideas of Johann Gottfried Herder. And of course, the model for the face of this new Jew, well, it would be that of his friend and colleague, Herzl. And you can see that he has created many, many images of Herzl here. Herzl as David, Herzl as Adam, Herzl as Moses, and Herzl as Judah. And it is actually Lilien who took this iconic photograph of Theodor Herzl leaning over the balcony at the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, Switzerland, probably in 1897 at the first Zionist Congress. And he's leaning over looking at the River Rhine. But the interesting thing about Buber and Lilien and a few of their colleagues was that they were more interested in culture, not politics, to inspire Jewish nationalism or Jewish nationhood. And so these cultural Zionists broke from the political Zionists under Herzl and Nordau at the 5th Zionist Congress in 1901, calling for a Jüdische or Jewish Renaissance. As Buber saw it, that was a word that he coined, high culture, literature, and the visual arts were the cornerstone of any national movement that sought to regenerate itself. In fact, the cultural Zionists themselves were also known as the Junge Jüdische Bewegung, or the Young Jewish Movement, and they recall similar young groups agitating for self-determination in the non-Jewish German world, such as Jung Deutschland or Young Germany, Jung Wien or Young Vienna, as well as Jugendstil itself, or youth style. And in anticipation of this renaissance, Lilien and Buber set up 3 things. Firstly, an exhibition of work by Jewish artists at the 5th Zionist Congress. Unfortunately, I can't find any photographs of the actual exhibition, but I can find a list of works that were created for the exhibition, and there were roughly 48 of them, and roughly a quarter of those are by Lilien himself. A nice way to promote yourself if you're an artist. Secondly, they created the very first Jewish press to publish modern Jewish literature and modern Jewish art. And you can see that Lilien created the symbol for the Jewish publishing house. And finally, the first Jewish illustrated arts magazine, Ost und West, which just means East and West. And it was trying, in a sense, to be a political vehicle for the unification of Jews from the East, or Eastern European Jews, sometimes derogatorily called Ostjuden, and West Jews, or Westjuden. And here on the left, we see the cover for Lilien's illustration of a young woman who stands in for the representation of this new nation. And of course, a woman as a trope for a nation were common at the time. She becomes a kind of Jewish Marianne, and I've given you an image of her who represented France, and a Jewish Germania who represented Germany. But interestingly, if you look at the actual image, she recalls the work of the pre-Raphaelites, I think, in England, William Holman Hunt and Edward Burke-Jones, except that there are Magen Davids flowing on her skirt and behind her head and on the top of her head, just in case you missed the symbolism. Now, this just brings us to Lillien's importance. Lilien was also a very important figure because he revived, the iconology or motifs associated with Judaism that were produced in the creative atmosphere of the cultural Zionist faction. To this day, symbols such as the Magen David or the cherubim, the winged angels who shield the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, remain a major part of his legacy at the Israeli National Art School, Bezalel in Jerusalem, where he worked for a very short period. And his prophetic construction of the new muscular Jew continues to reverberate in the Israeli psyche, first appearing on stamps in 1977 and contemporary book covers a little later, on Passover Haggadot throughout the Jewish world, and even in Bezalel. In modern Israeli paintings, and you can see here an image of Theodor Herzl by Moshe Kadishman looking over Tel Aviv and not the River Rhine. And even in the heart of Poland today, 115 years after he first created them. And these are works by the Israeli graffiti group called Broken Fingers. Finally, Lillien's muscular male images were often constructed as the exact opposite of the pseudoscientific theories on physical culture and racial hygiene that created anti-Semitic and degenerate images of Jews in journals at the Fin de Siècle. More familiar to us now as the well-known anti-Semitic portrayals by Stryker in his 1930s cartoons, flat-footed, knock-kneed, big-nosed, conspiring Jews. But on the left, circled in red, are these self-same stereotypes shown as early as 1898. No wonder Lillien's images of well-built socialist agrarian workers were so popular. Now, if we go back to Lillien's self-portrait in 1912 and look carefully, you'll see only just visible to the left, nearly positioned off the page, a nude woman and perhaps a fertility symbol, the Venus of Willendorf. Why did Lilien put these here? Well, I think they hint at another part of his oeuvre, dedicated not to national pursuits focused on Jewish identity, but to pursuits that suited any hot-blooded male avant-garde artist working at the turn of the 20th century. Even his image of the Jewish partner, if we now take another look, for Judah, seems positioned exactly for the male gaze. She's got, one of her breasts and her nipples there on show. And if we call the sarong that she's dressed in, you can see that it's sort of slowly revealing, but not quite, her genitalia, therefore very provocative. And so there are a number of questions that we need to ask. Were Lillien's images of women equal partners to his new, in brackets, male Jew? Or were they simply white male Western fantasies of femme fatales? Or thirdly, were there something else entirely? What we do know is that portrayals of nude erotic women were permanent tropes in Jugendstil or Art Nouveau, often doubling as a metaphor for the modern image of the new woman at the Fin de Siècle, or the turn of the 20th century. And this new woman appeared right at this moment towards the end of the 1890s in British and American literary journals. And here she is. She's dangerous because she wore pants. She had to if she was going to ride a bicycle, and that was also dangerous. And she agitated as a suffragette for equal voting rights, even more dangerous. She could be independent, strong-willed, and was capable of working outside of house and home. Working class women did indeed already do this, and many middle-class women were agitating to do the very same. In both Lilien and Musch's work, she is portrayed as a rather sensual and certainly provocative maternal earth mother, linked to nature with her flowing hair imitating the sensual lines of plant life. But you can see that Muscha has given her a cigarette, another dangerous activity for young modern women to be doing. But Lilien has given us a portrayal of her totally in the nude, very provocative. All she's got is her genitalia covered by her flowing hair, and there's a pan looking down at her, and he says to her, "My fair young lady, may I dare ... And of course, we, the audience, are supposedly able to fill that in with ravish you, rape you, perhaps. So pretty aggressive and rather provocative. However, Often women were depicted as even more dangerous, given the role as degenerate seducers of innocent young men. Such misogynist ideas were on display in Kokoschka's reviled play, Murderer, the Hope of Women, that was only on for one night. The poster shows a woman holding up the dead carcass of a man. Looks like she skinned him alive, although she does look rather like a zombie. More often than not, she was portrayed as a Jewish woman, a modern-day Judith or Salome, where the stereotype of an avenging woman is turned into a bloodthirsty Jewess. These dangerous Jewish women are depicted in Aubrey Beardsley's image on the left, which of course was based on Oscar Wilde's play, or in the middle as Klimt's seducer, Judith. And of course, Judith is holding up the head of Holofernes, and Salome is holding up the head of John the Baptist. Now, you can also see that in Aubrey's picture, Salome has two locks of her hair twirled like horns. And these, to my mind, I don't know what's happened here. Is there something just happened? I'm not quite sure what. I've lost the screen, but I don't quite know why. Let me just go back. Right, where were we? Sorry about that. If you think of those twirled like horns hair, you can also think of Moses and his devil horns. Such negative Jewish stereotypes helped create an even more sinister image of the modern Jewish woman who, as seductive actress Sarah Bernhardt or cross-dressing auteur Elsa Lasker-Schuler, did indeed exist. But apparently, to anti-Semites, pervaded modern European culture, she was everywhere with her degenerate, syphilis-ridden female and Jewish culture. And we all know that to be an actress was indeed a very subversive role for a Jewish woman or any woman at this particular time. So too, Jewish women were also linked to the East in British and French Orientalism as tropes for seduction and sensuality. They were often conflated with Eastern Arab or Turkish women as the colonial other, in similar stages of undress or in erotic positions as the exotic sexual predator. For instance, most of us now know that Jewish women were Delacroix's models in his Woman of Algiers, because non-Jewish women were not willing to model for him. So there's this further conflation. It's easy to see why Lilien, in his years as a graphic editor of Ost und West, became interested in showing non-Jews in particular that Jewish men and Jewish women were as honourable and courageous as their non-Jewish neighbours. Indeed, from 1906, when Lilien first went to Palestine to work for Boris Swarts, the director of Betzalel, he became obsessed with a new project that would dominate his life until at least World War I. This was the creation of what he called his Quibble Plan, a collaboration with railways. The contract was to include both an illustrated Hebrew Bible as well as a New Testament edition. To this end, Lilien immersed himself in the depiction of the East by two French Orientalist illustrators of the Bible, Gustave Doré and James Tissot. Now, this was the reason because particularly Gustave Doré's images in the kind of mid-19th century were very available to German Jewish or Central European German Jews in their Hebrew Bibles that were illustrated with Doré's work. And Tissot's work comes to prominence just at the end of the 20th century. So in the process, end of the 19th century. In the process, Lilien transforms their Orientalist iconography or their growing interest amongst Western artists in what was considered the exotic realism of the East into what we now call Orientalism. And this was a new groundbreaking Jewish national aesthetic. It's in Lilien's creation of this new, distinctly Jewish and German Orientalism, seen so clearly in his representations of Jewish women, I think in particular, that Lilien's work is crucial, constructing a heroic partner to this new male figure. Of course, Lilien's adoption of Orientalism as a style for German Jewish national aesthetics confirmed the resonance that the East had as a symbol of personal and political identity in the dynamics of the German Jewish imagination. And yet, The denigration of the East by European philosophers and cultures from Hegel onwards meant that acculturated German Jews often found themselves caught between the ideas of the Orient, the locus of the ancient Jewish people, and the world they lived in, the German Occident. Their non-Jewish German Enlightenment neighbours from Christian Wilhelm Dom onwards considered European Jewry themselves to be part of the East and thus degenerate and Asiatic in character. And Dom, a German historian, friend of Moses Mendelssohn and staunch advocate for Jewish emancipation, was still able to proclaim unequivocally in his book on the civic improvement of the Jews that the degenerate and Asiatic character of the Jewish nation was a product of political and historical circumstances. Even at the beginning of the 19th century, the Berlin lawyer Karl Grattenau could state that the cultured Jews may talk about Goethe, Schiller, and Schlegel all they please, but they nonetheless remain an alien Asiatic people. And towards the end of the century, in 1879, historian Heinrich von Treitschke pronounced that despite efforts at assimilation, German Jews were incorrigibly Oriental. Many Christian Orientalists set out to prove that the old covenantal relationships between Judaism and God were superseded by Christianity's more moral universe, while anti-Semitic German Orientalists like Friedrich Delitzsch denied the Jewish authorship of Western ideas such as monotheism and the laws or codes of European and therefore Christian morality altogether. Such attitudes were deflected by German Jewish Oriental scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, or the science of Judaism, who analysed Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts. And here I'm thinking of Abraham Geiger and in particular Heinrich Graetz. They often looked eastward to counter such anti-Jewish hatred. A similar interest was shared by a large number of Jewish novelists and poets in Central Europe, including Lasker Schuler and the cultural Zionists, who understood, sometimes just instinctively, that the modern European Jewish identity was located somewhere within the dialectic of Europe and the Orient. No wonder then that Lilien envisaged a 10-volume illustrated book of the Bible. Sadly, only 3 editions were published, but his depictions of the patriarchs as handsome, muscular heroes are shown together with images of biblical women. But the women that Lilien chose to portray often saved their people from death or annihilation, many years before notions of reinventing these heroines as feminist icons, which we're now used to, was common. For instance, Esther, and I'm going to concentrate on her as the Jewish queen of Persia, saves her people and questions male authority, an unusually contemporary view of biblical women for the period. And I think we need to understand that that's what Lilien's doing for many of the women at the period. So Doré and Tissot did indeed create images of Esther, using as much historical accuracy as they could muster, considering that Doré works in the mid-19th century and some of the archaeological finds, even Persepolis that he uses here in his background, hadn't been probably particularly dug at this particular time by archaeologists, but they did their best nonetheless. Lilien also strove for a certain amount of historical accuracy. Clustered behind Esther in his illustrations are other women from King Ahasuerus' harem. They wear what appears to be a Persian-inspired national dress and an abundance of silver filigree necklaces and headpieces that he may well have seen displayed in the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin, or perhaps he just picked them up when he was in the Jerusalem markets in 1906 and brought them back with him. Lilien, like Doré, also merged Assyrian, Egyptian, and Persian ideas, here with an Arab headband, but he uses stripes associated with the Jewish prayer shawl and the ancient Israelite tribe, plus even possibly something like the Jewish Galician hair coverings that he would have seen on his mother and his sisters. Unlike Doro or Tissot's Esther, Esther's face occupies most of the pictorial space in Lilien's image. She is depicted fully clothed, like all his biblical heroines, gazing at us, the attentive audience. Perhaps he used his wife Helene as a role model, but Lilien's Esther appealed to both secular and religious Jews as a larger-than-life depiction of Jewish bravery, a possible self-help manual for modern-day Jewish survival at the turn of the 20th century. And this use of the ancient Israelite tribal, costumes You can see it here in Lillien's The Thinker, and it also is based on so many of the photographs that Lilien took when he was in Palestine in 1906. And this image of The Thinker is based on his Samaritan high priest, or the Samaritan high priest at the time, Amram ben Yitzhak. Lillien's biblical females were also based on photographs that were taken by Lilien in 1906. Regrettably, there's no record of who the female sitters were who posed for him, though his sitters are strictly European types, rather than Mizrahi Jews or Arab women. These photographs were most probably taken back in Germany, or perhaps it was just simply harder to get Mizrahi or Arab women to pose for him. But the features of these models imply that Lillien's imagery of Jewish biblical women remained European in sentiment, even as he strove to reimagine the landscape and architecture of Palestine with a Jewish legitimacy. They also suggest a struggle by cultural Zionists themselves to make clear connections between the ancient Jewish world and the world of modern Central European Jewry, where they were still considered aliens and Asiatics. Without a doubt, Lillien's most sensual and erotic biblical illustrations of a female figure remain the well-known image in "A Garden Is My Betrothed" from the Song of Songs. And this image in particular celebrates the central story of the songs, which is the sexual awakening of a young girl and her male lover, an allegory for the love between God and the Jewish people. In this metaphor of sexual pleasure, the dark-eyed, dark-haired beauty here looks as if she's about to reach a sexual climax. She clasps her own breasts as her hair streams in front of her, imitating the dense pomegranate branches above her head, a symbol for fertility. And as some of you may well know, they are supposed to include many, many seeds, apparently specifically 613, which represent 613 mitzvot, indeed, in Judaism. Clearly Jewish, she wears a robe with stripes symbolizing ancient Israel's tribal costume. In this illustration, with minimal line and chiaroscuro, there is no mistaking her for an Aryan beauty. Now, Lilien had already portrayed Jewish women as strong and subversive. See his images of the mystical princess bride holding the sacred Torah with her bare shoulders on view in Judah in 1900. Or the secular harp player who stares at us with such an unwavering gaze in 1903. I, again, am not going to unpack these images here, but if you want to ask me questions about them, I'm very, very happy to unpack them for you in the Q&A. But his images of a Jewish woman as an active partner to sensual and sexual pleasure was groundbreaking. It was a radical departure from the illustrations we have already seen, and paradoxically, more in keeping with a secular Zionist agenda that wished to procure for the acculturated European mind an image of Judaism's rich religious heritage as a platform for modern cultural renewal. And Lilien tries to recapture these Jewish writings and artistic language for secular Jews through the prism of Jewish visual culture. And this was because acculturated German Jews and non-Jews alike would have been, in a sense, more familiar with the Christian text and imagery of the songs. Because they were plentiful, you could see many paintings in museums of the Song of Songs, and because they were not simply yet available in a German, or at least a High German translation from the original Hebrew. Yes, Moses Mendelssohn did translate the Hebrew Bible, but only into Yiddish. It was left to Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, who began that together in 1925. So just to show how groundbreaking these images of sensual and sexually charged Jewish women are with a sense of their own agency, I had to spend my last chapter researching other book illustrators or graphic artists who may have created similar imagery in the non-Jewish world, in the Oriental style and on biblical subjects. And you can see here, I looked through both Jungend and Simplicissimus, as well as any written books, perhaps with illustrations about Salome or Judith. And what I found were these two works by German artists, Marcus Beamer's work and Thomas Theodor Heine. They both created heroic Jewish female images of Judith and Salome, incorporating elements of the fashionable Orientalist style at the same time as Lilien. But Beamer's work is far less fluid and sophisticated than Lilien's linear style. You can see that, it's obvious. He is known for his illustrations of the 1903 rendition in German of Oscar Wilde's play about Salome that was translated by Hedwig Lachmann, actually, a Jewish woman who married Gustav Landauer, the anarchist, just by the way. And it was performed in a production by Max Reinhardt at the Schall and Drach Theatre, and it was set to music by Richard Strauss in 1905. But Beamer's work is a stronger, less erotic Salome than Beardsley's. Salome even looks in the water, appearing dumbfounded by her very deed. And also T.T. Hines' images of Judith are rather two-dimensional. They're flat representations, I know they're supposed to be, but they're almost caricatures of women. Heine himself was of Jewish origin, but he was brought up as a Christian. And compared to Lilien, and I just gave you this work here on Solomon because you can see some similarities between Heine's Judith, the picture of what looks like John the Baptist, and a work here by Lilien. You can see, compared to Lilien, whose knowledge of Jewish religious tradition and law reflected a well-developed, mature vision of the East and a serious engagement with the material culture of the East, its architecture, its dress, and its customs, Heine and Beamer's Orientalism seems very superficial and merely decorative. Even John the Baptist looks more Grimm's fairy tale ogre than biblical figure. So, in conclusion, Lilien's biblical illustrations wove together the images of the Jewish woman as femme fatale, biblical heroine, and Oriental beauty. Lilien's female images reveal the difficult tensions at play during the Fin de Siècle, where Jews were positioned both within and outside Europe's borders. Lilien's Jewish Orientalized women were not simply white Western male fantasies. Rather, they represented a fundamental and critical attempt to explore the complexities of German and Jewish identity. To Lilien, the Orient was not simply a fanciful place. Rather, it was an internal space to explore his multiple and transnational identities. Lilien's images of women formed part of that inner search for German Jewish identity, for roots and for meaning, a valid search for Heimat or home. It was indeed an act of visual redemption, I think, and a reimagination. Lilien's Jewish national Jugendstil art was only a very brief cultural moment in the history of cultural Zionism. His development of this rich phenomenon deserves to be re-examined, not only in the terms of Jewish Zionism, but his work also needs to be reinstated, I think, within the history of European graphic art and artists at the Fin de Siècle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, Dr. Swarts. So there was, as you know, a lot in your talk. There was a lot in your talk.
Yeah.
For our audience, I also want to tell people that the recording has closed captions. So for those of you who want to listen again, you might have an aid. So there's so much, there's quite a few questions in the chat, and I have some questions. And I want to push you a little bit on your conclusion. We can't bring up that slide right now, but that you sort of, it's not merely, if you will, the white male Orientalist gaze of these women, but much more to do with his German, the complexities of his German Jewish identity, or really it's, German Jewish, I might say East Central European, right? Given that he's from Drohobych. So can you just, expand a little bit on that claim, how the images that he created added to his understanding of the modern East Central or German Jew. Can you say more about that?
Are you saying that because they're not, or I mean, look, obviously, as I tried to point out, he was a hot-blooded Jewish male working, or male, forget the Jewish part, working at the turn of the 20th century, right? And of course, you know, Jugendstil and Art Nouveau, as we well know, have so many tropes of, you know, naked, you know, women, right? I think that part of the reason I wanted to look into this was that people have dismissed, and maybe that's one of the reasons they haven't written about his images of women. They've dismissed his work as this kind of femme fatale and therefore anti-feminist view of women. And so what I wanted to pursue in my work was I wanted to look a little deeper and what this might mean when he then not just creates images for Jugend or any other images that it created in the non-Jewish world, but when he transforms them into the biblical images that he was incredibly interested in, they become something else, I think. And I think that this is where I think where his work is crucial. And also, I think he does it beautifully. So he uses that interest in the Orientalist idea, this kind of white Western femme fatale. And we haven't even spoken about Said in terms of what that might mean for Orientalism. But what I think he does is that he transforms that into a living, breathing understanding of what it meant for him. He's actually exploring his own roots. And this is what, it wasn't just, you know, male, and that's why I wanted to bring us up to El Scholastica. It wasn't just men who were Jewish at the time, who were trying to come to terms with what it meant to be German in Central Europe, but also part of, you know, the East, right? And both within Zionists and also himself as an Eastern European Jew, sometimes derogatorily called an Ostjuden. These were very, very interesting points to come to terms with. And I think it was also part of that Orientalism degenerate idea at the time that viewed Jews in Germany, even where they were at the height of their cultural peak, as like Asiatics and others. And so I think that they are a tremendous way for him and other artists working at the time to interrogate their own roots, both their German roots and their Jewish roots.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's very clear that his, I mean, one could look at these visual images of women and say he's just objectifying them. Yep. Or you could say, which was what you're saying, no, he's empowering them. And yep. I kind of have graphic novels on the brain for a whole host of reasons these days. And it strikes me that even though he's not a graphic novelist, that illustrative character of his work raises, some of those questions are being raised today by graphic novelists who depict women in very sensual. The reason it's on my brain is that the Aline Kaminsky-Crumb's obituaries in the papers today. She was a graphic novelist and the partner of Robert Crumb, a very, very famous underground comics artist. And you can criticize, many people do, these graphic novelists' seeming objectification of women. But when a woman, in her case, when a woman does it and gives them sensuality and, you know, empowers them like Judith and Esther, it really turns the tables on the perception that it's merely an objectification and speaks more to the way gender becomes part of the Zionist project. So yes. I hope I understood you, and I think that that's really fascinating.
Yes, yes, and that's what I was trying to do. You know, it's a very difficult, delicate balance, because I mean, we could even look at the image from the Song of Songs and say, oh, okay, again, positioned for the male gaze. But I do think there's something else that he's dealing with. You have to understand that's the culture that he's imbued with, right? Yes, he's a man. Yes, he's got gendered ideas. But at the same time, I think there's something else going on that was understood and was appreciated by German Jews at the time. And that's why they were so incredibly interested in his work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have a question about the reception east of German lands, but I want to give the audience, we have some great questions in the chat. So let me pose those first and maybe I can circle back. So one of our participants asked, the Judith panel at the end with the severed head should traditionally depict Holofernes, was there some notion of John the Baptist being interposed in that scene or story? Now, I just want to say, Gabriel, is there any way to bring that slide up for people so they can see it again, if that's possible? If not, not. But of
yes, I'm about to start sharing. One moment.
Okay,
please.
great. So, but you, Lynn, go ahead.
Yes. Right, that image of is it the depiction of Judith? I think that's just my mistake. Yes, it's Holofernes. It's not John the Baptist.
Oh, okay, good. So good. So another question. Has there been a major exhibition of Lillien's work outside of Israel or even in Israel, and of the kind of images that you're showing?
No, there has not. There has been an exhibition by Ezra Mendelssohn's son, Amitai Mendelssohn. There are some images.
Wait. You just mentioned Ezra Mendelssohn, my great teacher. So
yes.
So yes. Ezra Mendelssohn, and also in this context, when you say the word Mendelssohn and you went back to the 18th century, people might be a little bit confused. So let me just clarify here, if you don't mind. Also, you mentioned someone who's very dear to me as a scholar. So Ezra, the late Ezra Mendelssohn, for our audience, was an extremely important modern Jewish scholar of Eastern European and Russian Jewish history, but also of art. Very extremely important to him. He did a major study of Moritzky Gottlieb, and his son, someone I guess following in the family business, is also an art historian, and that's Amitai Mendelssohn. So go ahead, Lynn, go ahead.
So I'm actually talking about Amitai Mendelssohn, although of course I did very briefly mention Morris Gottlieb in my talk, because it is indeed Ezra Mendelssohn talking about Morris Gottlieb, who brings up the incredible anti-Semitism that was thriving at the Art Academy in Krakow in the 1880s and through to the 20th century. But Amitai Mendelssohn, and I keep turning my head up because I'm trying to find the name of his book, his exhibition, which I didn't see, but I saw the book, and it was a wonderful exhibition. The book is incredible. I'm just trying to find it. Oh my gosh, I can't. The title of it. It was done around about 2016 from memory. And so there are some images of Lillian in there, but that's it. There have been, over the centuries, some images. There were some exhibitions by a man called Hasenklaver, who lived in Munich. He put out some small exhibitions about his work. And there have been some, maybe, say, the 100 Years of Israeli Art by Yigal Zamona mentions Lillian and has a few pages on him. And there are other images, other exhibitions that have used his work, but there is no detailed exhibition just on Lillian's work. Yeah. Okay,
so quick question. We have some others, but how do you account for, look, those of us in this business, we're always saying so-and-so is neglected, and I'm the one who's discovered why they're so important. And then you realize there's so much to know that how can everyone, I mean, who isn't neglected? But given the prominence of Lillian's work in Zionist iconography, given the fact that for those of us in the field, we see his stuff all over the place, how do you account for the fact, I mean, it is odd that there hasn't been sort of a major retrospective of his work?
Yeah, I really do not know the answer to that. I have spoken to Amitai, I've spoken to the Israel Museum. Yigal Zamona is fascinated by it, interested in it, but so far nothing has come of that.
Interesting.
I don't know, perhaps it was because, maybe people are worried, as I said, about those Femme Fatales. I think there's so much more that we can unpack about Lillian when we look at his work and decode it. So I really don't know the answer to that, Nancy. If I did, I'd be doing it.
It seems to me that really the Fin de Siècle context would allow people to, I mean, there was, it was the end of empire. There was a lot. He was hardly the first to be involved with such erotica. I mean, you think, and in Western Ukraine, or what I call, Galicia, is this cosmopolitan modernist space. And you have literary works that are depicting highly sensualized activities, you know, Safra Mosler. I mean, we could go on and on. So we'll have to figure that out.
Yeah.
Here's another question for you. And maybe, Gabriel, you can bring up that iconic image of Herzl posing as the prophet. Can you say more? The question is to you, Lynn. Can you say more about Herzl overlooking the Rhine and why that became so iconic in Jewish visual culture and imagery?
I think his image with Herzl looking over the River Rhine was just one of those early photographic works of this huge founder Herzl. And the fact that Lilien took it, I mean, he took it in 1897 at the first Zionist Congress that I don't think he actually spent much time at. He was employed to take photographs. But I just think that it's something that lives on in the Jewish national psyche. And though you say it might be, you know, or even I say it's iconic, it's well known. Look, there are people, when I go to Israel, you know, just popular people that you speak to there who have no idea that this image was done by Lilien. In other words, and here in Sydney, Australia, no idea that this is a Lilien work, right? So they just know it's a picture of Theodor Herzl, yeah, looking over the River Rhine. And I think because he is such a profound man, and Herzl, you know, was really influenced by him. I don't want to start to mention a kind of, you know, there are many people who've derogatory or looked at Lillien's work and said, oh, they're homoerotic. He probably loved Judah, loved, you know, giving Judah the face of Herzl because, like, you know, there's something homoerotic going on here. And I don't think that's at all true. I mean, he was a, you know, he had affairs outside of marriage, let's put it that way. You know, his wife, Helene, was upset about that. So, you know, all up, there it is. That's Moshe Kadishman. And you can see, look, I just think it's emblematic of the interest in, or the importance that Herzl had in the founding of the modern Jewish state. And that this image is just profoundly reused over and over again. I mean, you can go to Israel, you can pick up these little figurines of Herzl looking over the River Rhine. Yes. So I just think it's an image of its time. And the fact that, you know, Lilien keeps putting images of Herzl in all his male new Jews is fascinating in itself. And I think it's because, you know, he just represented somebody who seemed to be, you know, incredibly important of his moment, with a trimmed beard. It was not an ultra-Orthodox, you know, rattly beard. It was trimmed. And you can see, if this is an image of the real Herzl, in Lillien's images, his beard is even shorter. And that would be, you know, he's an Eastern European Jew, Lilien at heart, and he knew what was going on in religious circles. He was absolutely not religious in any way, shape, or form, just to let you know.
Right. I think that probably one would have to look at the media production, you know, how this, you know, at this moment when you can start producing postcards and the actual sort of consumer culture around these things. Yes. That makes it so popular. But I want to just push you on one thing, and then I have another question. I would be, personally, I think that, you know, homoeroticism is perfectly compatible with heterosexual extramarital affairs. Yeah. You know, there's no doubt in Nordau's conception of the Muskeljude, you know, the apotheosizing of the new Jew as this, you know, sturdy, virile man, that there isn't some homoeroticism. It doesn't mean people are acting on it, although of course some people are. So I wouldn't personally, I don't think there's a problem with saying that it exists. And look, homoeroticism exists in other aspects of Jewish culture, and most particularly Hasidism, right? I mean, yeah. You know, you have all male environments, there's going to be homoeroticism. Someone has another question though. They would like you to talk about, if you can, Lillien's family members who live around the world, including in Israel, Europe, and Australia. You've mentioned meeting them for your research. So perhaps you can tell us a little more about how you found them, what they had to say to you, what kind of goodies they gave you.
You know, Lillian and Helene had 2 children, Otto, who was the oldest, and Hannah, who was the youngest. And of course, they have now got offspring all around the world, including relatives here in Australia. And the first thing for me was that I was just giving a talk, I think at my local shul, and 2 members from our shul came up to me and said, excuse me, I am related distantly to Lillian. So that is the first cab off the rank. And then they were incredibly willing to give me their own books of the Bible, which at that stage I'd only photocopied from the Center for Jewish History in New York. So then I suddenly had original copies of the books of the Bible, which was tremendously important. And I also had other works that he illustrated, including works by his son, Otto Lilien. Then I started, from these relatives, I was able to get email addresses of Hannah's relatives in Copenhagen and Otto's relatives in Jerusalem, or out of Jerusalem, in Israel. And I did not go to Copenhagen, but I had a very lengthy email with one of the relatives of Hannah, who is in Copenhagen, and he gave me a tremendous bit of information. He gave me really a kind of genealogical tree of Lillian and all his relatives, which was tremendous. Couldn't have done the work without it. And then in Israel, I went and I met with Otto's daughter, or one of his 2 daughters, on their kibbutz in just out of Israel, and I'm just trying to think of the name. Kibbutz Brenner. You know, yeah, famous, in a sense, German Jewish kibbutz, although also, you know, Eastern European as well. So, and she gave me some wonderful insights and showed me some other interesting books that were really important for my research as well. Yeah, which also showed me just how popular he was. That kind of Kevin Bacon. He knew so many German-speaking Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals, and you know, that I think is another side to him. He was very, very prolific, mainly because he was a struggling artist, I'm sure, who needed work, and also because he was in the center. Berlin was the center at this moment, at the beginning of the 20th century, in this kind of revival of Jewish German culture. So. You know, and also I think because he was from Eastern Europe, he had a whole nother sense to him. I mean, and even on the front of Buber, I mean, Buber, though born in Vienna, you know, his parents, you know, separate, and he ends up being brought up, of course, in Lemberg by his grandfather and grandmother. And so, of course, you know, Lillian and him have this incredible connection, right? And then you get Stefan Zweig, who is terribly a Westjuden, and he writes eventually in his 1942 autobiography that Lillian was the first, and he calls him an Ostjuden, I ever met. And then he became my bestest friend. So, you know, yeah, Lillian was able to straddle those 2 worlds. And he also, remember, he married a Westjuden, a German Jewish girl from the Magnus family in Braunschweig, who of course did not take lightly to Lillian as an Eastern European Jew, and that's another story. But they were able to get together, they lived together, you know, they got married, they had children. So, you know, on one level, this is a lovely story of Ost and West coming together.
Like
and of course,
journal.
that's also part, you know, of that whole Lillian, Buber, Ost and West, right? It is, and I do a whole chapter on that, the kind of creation of a united, you know, Jewish front in Europe at the time.
Well, we're going to close now. I want to thank you, and I also want to just tell our listeners that you can find Dr. Swarts's book in paperback, and please avail yourself of it. And if there's an exhibition that she is able to initiate, we'll also let you know about that. And I would just add, given my own expertise or my engagement, you know, behind every West European Ashkenazic Jew is an East European Jew, and they're mirroring identities because of the encounter with modernity and the slower pace of adaptation or acculturation of East European Jews, the similarities between German and Yiddish, and the fact also that Galicia is Poland, but it's under the Habsburgs. So it is by definition a sort of hotbed or cauldron of the meeting of East and West. So we've talked about Vienna and Berlin in this webinar, but another great city to look at is of course Lviv or Lvov today under terrible attack by the Russians. I can't help but say that. So again, I want to thank you so much for a provocative, beautifully illustrated lecture. Thank you so much for sharing those images beyond Herzl for all of us. And I want to tell our audience that as you expect, in this 25th anniversary of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, we have wonderful things coming up in the spring. We have a virtual mini course, A Stranger to My Brothers, Who and What Were Apostates in Ancient Judaism, which will be taught by one of our visiting scholars, Avraham Yoskovich. And that will be 3 Wednesday evenings, January 25th, February 1st, and February 8th from 7 to 8. Again, the title is Stranger to My Brothers, Who and What Were Apostates in Ancient Judaism. My colleague, Azan Yadin Israel, is giving an extremely interesting lecture, different from today, but also on visual culture, on his forthcoming book called Temptation Transformed: How the Forbidden Fruit Became an Apple. And that is going to be in person. So I hope you'll come out for that. That's February 22nd at 7 p.m. at the Douglas Student Center. And if you check our website and pay attention to your emails, you'll see other things that will going on in the spring. Importantly, April 19th, Robert Alter, the esteemed American biblical critic and literary scholar, is also coming in person to campus. So I look forward to seeing you both online and in person. And I want to thank the staff, Karen Small, the managing director of the Bildner Center, Darcy Marr, our communications director, Gabriel Duke, who was our aide-de-camp IT supernova during this, Sarah Portilla, our cultural coordinator, and also Jenny Gurman, who is the senior business director of the center. We can't do anything without our staff. They work tirelessly, and I want to thank them again publicly for everything they've done for the 25th anniversary. And I would be remiss if I didn't say to all of you that this is our 25th anniversary celebration. All of the programs we do are free, as you know, but the Bildner Center needs your support, and we welcome it with open arms. So thank you so much, Lynn. I hope our paths cross again soon. And thank you to our audience. Good night, stay safe and warm.
Bye.